Hi guys and welcome. This is Jen Gaeta Siciliano, artist, memoir writer, bipolar psychiatric survivor, and your host of Not As Crazy As You Think podcast, the place that offers an alternative perspective on mental illness, highlighting creativity, non-conventional healing, and breaking on through to the other side. If you are ready for a new narrative on the mental realm that celebrates crazy and cool without penalty, then Not As Crazy As You Think is for you. So it was 5 years since St. Paddy's Day 2017 when my world fell out from beneath my feet. Sitting behind their invisible bars in a jail cell concentration camp style once again, I decided with conviction that this so-called hospitalization bullshit for my own mental health was going to end once and for all. I would be the narrator of my own story, and this one flew over the cuckoo's nest bedlam mental patient forever lifestyle was no longer going to be the backdrop of my life. I walked away convinced I would never return. And yet, months later, I did. It was during that weekend on December 17th, 2017, when I time traveled into the future and had the vision about nuclear war with Russia, and everyone thought I was crazy. So that was my last visit to the hospital 4 years ago, and I made my peace. I mean, as much as I could make peace with the fucking disaster that's about to hit. You guys have no idea. You need to catch up, and you will, but that's the next book. I can't help that I have visions or hear the voices of my guides or ancestors. I had a near-death experience when I was 22, and crossing over to the other side and then miraculously living to tell about it will definitely change the way your mind thinks, forever. But I always knew the experience changed me for the better, and yet it was that very experience that got me labeled permanently mentally ill. Well, by their standards. When they issued me this lifelong illness with certainty that there was no cure, I thought, how could you possibly know that? Aren't you interested in recording my life to see how it plays out? No, they weren't, because they already had the answers. I remind you that this was 27 years ago. Not much has changed, except now they're even more arrogant. I have repeatedly stated in my hospital records, I don't see my mind as an illness. It is a gift. Gift of insight, gift of creativity, of connection with the other side. Is that too far-reaching to claim? Is it faith-based? As faith-based as psychiatry's claims of certainty that no evidence today may mean some evidence one day in 30 years. If they are lucky enough to keep getting funded for their visions of bio-influenced minds into eternity, they may in fact be right about some of their assumptions. But by that time, AI will be telling us what to think anyway. Think for yourself while you still can. So no, I can't help it that I can see the future. In 1994, I went back in time to colonial India. The last memory I had, I was in an ancient past as an untouchable on the streets of New Delhi. And then next thing I knew, I had died and gone to heaven on the emergency plane ride home. But in returning, I didn't know what time period I would land. Although it was 1994, it felt much further ahead in time because I saw things that didn't yet exist and that I found to become true decades later. So how can I or anyone make sense of this phenomenon? There is no explanation except pathology, right? Even though there's no evidence there either? Because the science of psychiatry has declared itself the global expert agency in matters of the mind, the masses are to just go aimlessly forward in submission to their theories, research, and conclusions, right? You can believe it all, of course, if you choose to. But living in a world where their narrative has taken over the tongues of every layperson, it took me a while to realize that I truly wasn't crazy. And it took me even up until first doing this podcast in 2020 to realize just how many people are trying to be heard, like me, and they're all saying the same thing. We need to take care of people with mental health issues today, okay? Less theory, more results. The lies and fabrications are a lot deeper than anyone realizes, and it has less to do with illness and much more to do with social constructs. First, what do we mean by disorder or illness? I'm not going to go into all the history here. There are a lot of books out there that can provide you with what you need to start your research, and just within this last decade. And in them, you can see that there has been no progress in certainty about biological causes of mental illness, despite claims of such a thing. And then there's a whole lot of books on the problems with diagnostic systems, which decide who is mentally ill in our society. Books such as Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America by Robert Whitaker in 2010. In 2013, The Book of Woe, the DSM, and the Unmaking of Psychiatry, written by Gary Greenberg. In 2014, Saving Normal, an Insider's Revolt Against Out-of-Control Psychiatric Diagnosis, DSM-5, Big Pharma, and the Medicalization of Ordinary Life by Alan Francis. In 2014, Cracked, The Unhappy Truth About Psychiatry by James Davies. In 2017, Mental Health Incorporated, How Corruption, Lax Oversight, and Failed Reforms Endanger Our Most Vulnerable Citizens by Art Levine. And in 2019, Mind Fixers, Psychiatry's Troubled Search for the Biology of Mental Illness by Anne Harrington. So start here if you want to begin the journey along this research that questions the systems in place and why. But I'm going to share specifically one study which I found to be ridiculous. The study I will look at will show how deep the rabbit hole goes in their world of research. A team of Canadian researchers explored the possibility that psychopathy lacks certain hallmarks of a mental disorder, so should be considered more like a function operating as intended. The study was published in Evolutionary Psychology at the end of 2021, entitled, Is Psychopathy a Mental Disorder or an Adaptation? Evidence from a meta-analysis of the association between psychopathy and handedness. This study is exploring if we should even include the concept of psychopathy within the list of mental disorders. If we're going to have a list of mental disorders, guys, and we let this one go, then I don't know what a mental disorder is. The dictionary states that psychopathy is a condition characterized by callousness, detachment, and a lack of empathy. Psychopaths can be highly manipulative, and their antisocial nature inclines them often to criminality. Of course, not always. Psychopathy itself is not listed in the DSM or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, but its traits can be delineated in the clinical label of antisocial personality disorder. So many of us might naturally believe that someone in a mental state who causes harm to himself or someone else is at risk of being mentally ill. Isn't that what they've told us? Well, I am much more dangerous than the psychopath, according to their world. And my personality type is much more aligned with a mentally ill narrative than a psychopath, according to their evolutionary psychology upon which psychiatry is based in theory. So what is a mental disorder from an adaptationist perspective? According to J.C. Wakefield in his 1992 article, The Concept of Mental Disorder on the Boundary Between Biological Facts and Social Values, from American Psychologist, the concept of mental disorder is fundamental to theory and practice in the mental health field, but no agreed on or adequate analysis of this concept currently exists. Wakefield calls a true disorder harmful dysfunction, where dysfunction refers to the failure of an internal mechanism, whether it be physical, cognitive, or affective, to perform a function for which it has been designed through natural selection to perform, while harmful refers to the consequences of this mechanism's failure that are deemed undesirable by social and cultural standards. Under this conceptualization, a syndrome of cognition and behavior would have to satisfy both criteria, that it is dysfunctional and harmful, to qualify as a mental disorder. But this is the problem with seeing everything through the lens of the story of evolution, because it's all theory. It's not happening right now, but over millions of years and with today's prejudices and perspectives that determine how we see things. And just because something occurred and led to evolutionary selection, that doesn't mean it is necessarily advantageous long-term to the human race. And I think we can agree that psychopathy fits that point. So what is their point? In the study abstract, it states even though the causes of mental disorders are not fully understood, one likely contributor is perturbations affecting neurodevelopment. Now, neurodevelopment perturbations are conditions that influence pre, peri, or postnatal brain development, which can occur during gestation, labor and delivery, or infancy and adolescence, and have been linked to other mental illnesses such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. In some past research, they have linked those who have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia as having a higher proportion of left-handed people. Non-right-handedness is a sign of such perturbations, which suggests a neurodevelopmental problem. So, if psychopathy is a mental disorder, psychopaths should show elevated rates of non-right-handedness. However, an adaptive strategy perspective expects psychopaths to be neurologically healthy and therefore predicts typical rates of non-right-handedness. So, instead of psychopathy being a mental disorder, the other view is that psychopathy is considered an alternative life history strategy. From the study, I quote, "According to this view, the risk-taking, opportunistic, and callous traits of psychopaths increased their reproductive success in ancestral environments by exploiting the trusting, cooperative individuals who form the majority of the population. So, in their view, despite the harm it causes others, if it is not related to the failure of an evolved psychological mechanism, we cannot call it a mental disorder. We can instead call it an alternative strategy that has been selected for evolution because of its positive effects on fitness, favored by selection over successive generations." So let's review. The goal of this study then is to show a positive association between psychopathy and neurodevelopmental perturbations, which would support the mental disorder model, whereas a negative association would support the adaptive life history model. So the question is, to what extent do psychopathic individuals exhibit signs of neurodevelopmental perturbations compared to non-psychopathic individuals? And since neurodevelopmental perturbations are difficult to assess directly, they will measure them indirectly through non-right-handedness. Bottom line, are psychopaths more likely to display non-right-handedness compared to non-psychopathic individuals? And will the evidence prove to you either way that a psychopathic individual isn't off his rocker? What is mental illness? In response to the study, Science Alert shouts out this title. Wild paper claims psychopathy may not be a mental disorder, but something else. Mike McRae writes on March 16, 2022, "The line between broken and useful traits can be hazy in biology, leaving open the possibility that what is now considered a malfunction might once have been promoted by natural selection." Well, I say this all the time about voice hearers in general. Who's to say that one day these traits won't one day save the human race, or at least be favorably selected to be passed down through unknown variables? That being said, what we now regard as malfunction within the 374 labels may also one day prove to be among the strongest traits chosen for natural selection, and many do not have any neurodevelopmental perturbations associated with them. Can we now tear apart the DSM Bible, please? Their conclusion is based on an analysis of existing research containing measures of psychopathy together with details on the person's handedness. However, as McRae points out, this correlation echoes outdated science from the early days of criminal psychology. That's right, people. For all you lefties out there who scrolled quickly past this study in your newsfeed, how do you feel about the arbitrary nature of mental disorders now? In this very new and modern study, they are using historical links that have been largely debunked. At least I thought they were, but interestingly, they are still being studied. Other-handedness, especially left-handedness, was a convenient sign at one time for a predictive factor of a person's ill-fated status as a delinquent. And up until the post-war years, there was minimal tolerance for left-handedness. But under the influence of John Dewey's progressive education movement, acceptance of individual differences and nonconformity developed in schools. But even as late as the 1960s and 70s, Catholic school teachers in particular routinely inflicted psychological pressure on left-handed students, and sometimes corporal punishment. The study goes on to explain the whys behind looking at several different studies, but only to boil it down to 16 of them, which ultimately informed the conclusion, combining data on just under 2,000 people, making it statistically weak. Further, to limit a variable down to the ones they wish to isolate is often quite hard in meta-analysis studies, and low statistical power prevents the discovery of group differences that can be there. Most of all, the samples were either partially or completely composed of female participants, and this very thoughtfully articulated adaptive life history perspective pertains specifically to men. So how can these samples even be a decent selection to prove or disprove such a supposition either way? I believe the study was informative, but scientific? No. And yet, what are the websites exclaiming? Article titles like the one from PsyPost. Meta-analysis suggests psychopathy may be an adaptation rather than a mental disorder. Oh, really? Is that what it suggests? But that's what people read, and that's what people talk about through their memes. And this is how scientific evidence regarding mental illness research gets thrown into the hands of the public. But beyond all this, the philosophical question is, what makes a difference in form or function a disease in the first place? So again, what is mental illness? And who is definitively mentally ill? I'll tell you who they have pegged for sure, with no vision of what we can offer the future. The voice hearers, the visionaries, the artists, the sympathizers, and the empaths. We have no role in future evolution. And this is what's so sad to me, because how can they possibly claim to know what was chosen to evolve? It is a story, and it's their fucking fantasy. So it's this term I have a problem with. Scientists now know. And because this culture wants to be pro-science without asking the whys and whats behind the science being done, we are continually getting dumber. Because as the scientists continually talk about what they do know, what we also know at the same time is that they don't know. I mean, a book just came out that I still have yet to read called Healing, Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health by Thomas Insel, who for 13 years ran the United States' foremost mental health research institution, the NIMH, or the National Institute for Mental Health. He helped allocate $20 billion in federal funds and sharply shifted the focus of the NIMH away from behavioral research and toward neuroscience and genetics. Dr. Insel writes, I should have been able to help us bend the curves for death and disability, but I didn't. Dr. Insel left NIMH in 2015, and although he calls the advances in neuroscience of the last 20 years spectacular, he says that for the most part they haven't yet benefited patients. Dr. Insel optimistically believed that advances in neurobiology would lead to new treatments, but here it is, 20 years later after he bet big on genomics, and we have yet to discover the roles genetics play in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which have proven to be extraordinarily complex. From the New York Times article, The Nation's Psychiatrist Takes Stock with Frustration, writer Ellen Barry writes how Insel, quote, describes an epiphany during his last year at NIMH after he had delivered a PowerPoint presentation to a group of advocates touting researchers' progress on genetic markers. A man in a flannel shirt got to his feet and reeled off the story of his 23-year-old son who has schizophrenia. a cycle of hospitalizations, suicide attempts, and homelessness. "Our house is on fire," the man said, "and you are talking about the chemistry of the paint. What are you doing to put out this fire?" In that moment, I knew he was right, Dr. Insel writes. Nothing my colleagues and I were doing addressed the ever-increasing urgency or magnitude of the suffering millions of Americans were living through and dying from. End quote. And although he supports the work his researchers once led, at my age, he said, I can't wait 30 years. And that's how I felt with every day passing for the 3 decades under their rule. I've been waiting around for their answers and for their discoveries to explain my mind. No, the research that is being done is not helping anyone today. And based on studies like this one on psychopathy, lefties, and evolution theory, they continue not helping people. And yet I just love how when someone who challenges psychiatry with alternative forms of healing, defenders of psychiatry say, well, those things don't have any evidence of working. Psychiatry is evidence-based. But how are they pulling together this evidence? And what are the initiatives by which they carry out their studies? It's on theory, not alternative treatments outside of the mega industrial complex that the mental health industry has become. There are a litany of choices for healing out there that anyone can choose if they had more scientific weight, meaning more research which is circulated to the public. People don't even know about choices because the only thing that is offered to them is a survey on their symptoms, a script for a pill, and a lifelong label they are told they must learn to live with, along with all the medication side effects. Essentially, over the course of 3 decades, there has really been no major progress in finding out biological causes that can help in treatment. Yet, instead of looking at things as pathology, can't we utilize ideas of functional medicine? If biology does have an influence, doesn't that include lifestyle choices that can affect our biology just as diet and exercise and supplemental balance can? But that course of action doesn't apply to big pharma, so not as much research. If psychiatrists wish to help patients for real, they need to identify the root causes of symptoms by learning about the role of functional medicine and help them make lasting lifestyle changes. For us to be married to this idea that you're born with it, it's in your genes, when there's been no genes defined, and millions of dollars of both public and private funding going into continued genomic projects, this is a story. And it's fine. It's good to have stories, so that we can explore those stories. But how many decades are you going to go down the same path with the same initiatives, with the same old theories? It doesn't matter how we evolved. What now matters is that we're here. This is not about the origin of humankind's assets and liabilities through genetic natural selection. It's about the here and now with our emotions and our sadness and our suffering and how to treat it. When there's so many millions of people saying that the system doesn't work for them, that alone should be enough of a reason to consider that the people who are asking for help, maybe they want something better than just assuming that everything gets boiled down to the physical components of their brains. But they are the professionals, right? With the expert opinions. The psychiatrists have the world's cooperation with their position. They have the schools, they have the insurance companies, and they have the courtrooms. But that doesn't create mental health in a society. And by every measure, as an advanced nation, the U.S. is the country that has the poorest outcomes for mental health treatments. With so many psychiatrists these days fighting all over social media with anti-psychiatry critics, who are not their enemies, by the way, but their ex-patients, it's sad to see how much they are floundering. But there are some out there who are making changes in the field and hopefully breaking through its dogmatic ways. There's 2 psychiatrists in particular who are amazing, and their work introduced me to the film Medicating Normal, which has changed my life. Dr. Rani Bora and Dr. Suraj Gojoy are both holistic psychiatrists and innate health coaches. Doctors Rani and Suraj grew concerned by the rising trend to go after quick temporary fixes to address the human condition, disregarding the core underlying causes of psychological suffering, and feel that the Conventional models of managing mental and emotional issues do not help us discover our true well-being. In their mental health mastery summits, they share the principles of innate health as an alternative to understand and manage mental and emotional suffering. I bring them up because what constitutes a good psychiatrist to me is one who wants to challenge the belief that individuals with mental health issues are broken, needing to be fixed. If psychiatrists could see through the bullshit philosophy and stand up for the idea that their patients can heal, that neuroplasticity is also real for them, not just for the normals, maybe we can move forward and make some strides. They need to understand the limitations of this so-called evidence-based medicine and the concerns about the widespread use of psychiatric medicines. Educate to make informed choices about psychiatric medicines. Being honest about their possible non-effectiveness, long-term harm, and side effects. These are the things that can make differences in the lives of others from a good psychiatrist. Well-being is a state. It's a state of mind, and we need to maintain our well-being, and we can give ourselves the preventative by putting in this effort. And there are plenty of other healing modalities that many other people have found successful. For me personally, I will tell you, since I finally stopped listening to their insistence that their treatment is the best treatment and the only treatment that works and that should be pursued, when I finally let that go, my life changed. Because this isn't about saving the field's philosophy, if it is destined to crumble into antiquated notions of the human mind. It's happened before. This is about, if you are truly a good psychiatrist, can you adapt? These are the good ones who are evolving with the times. The ones who don't ignore the problems, cross their fingers and hope they were right in spending all their money on a psychiatric degree. My whole life went by, and as a result of their programs, I have not been living such a luxurious life as many psychiatrists are. But if we are to be good researchers and budding innovators, when we notice problems in systemic institutions, we should admit the wrongs and try to improve things. And that starts with how we view things, beginning with how we view mental illness. And so here it is, 27 years in the system. In that time passing, I have grown as a human being. I have evolved. I have adapted. In time passing, we become better people. And if we paid attention to what the lessons of our lives have shown us, much of our suffering can be avoided. And with the suffering that cannot be avoided, we can at least find meaning, if they let us. Meaning outside of, I am sick and I need an institution that claims it knows how my brain works and that I need them forever to give me pills. It's just not true. There's some suffering that is outside your control. Look at all the Ukrainians out there. They didn't ask for the Russian invasion, which led to their suffering of today, but to give meaning to this suffering. That's the beauty of life. I'm proud to say, in moving forward, that I wish to have a Ukrainian will and a Zelensky quality defiance to the bullies of psychiatry who wish to continue their stories of right and wrong, normal and abnormal, pathology and non-pathology, interpretations of our world to the sleeping masses. I stand by my people, those who have been harmed in the name of health and experimentation for the larger goal of preserving the professional name of psychiatry and supposed moral intentions of the field, even if the patients they claim to help continue to remain harmed. But not on account of their system, because they are the ones to blame. The individual is to blame instead of society, right? Unless, of course, you adapted as a psychopath. Thanks for listening to Not As Crazy As You Think, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And remember, mental health is attainable for anyone, especially those labeled with mental illness. Until next time, peace out.